hope this is working correctly. Coming up, the uncanny similarities between one of the most influential comic book legacies and one of the most monstrous but beloved television sitcoms. Two of the most iconic monster families in pop culture are the Munsters and the Fantastic Four. But looking at their two histories in the early 1960s, when both series were created essentially at the same time, was the Munsters TV show actually inspired by the Fantastic Four comic books? Find out the surprising similarities between them on this episode of Monster Complex. Monster Complex! Hi, I'm Chris Well, and this is Monster Complex, where we celebrate stories about monsters and the people who hunt them and/or love them. Whether you're a fan of the X-Files, Beetlejuice, Godzilla and Kong, or the Universal Monsters, you're going to dig this channel. Make sure that you subscribe right now. Click on the big red button and click the bell so you always know when our latest stuff comes out. You can also visit me online at monstercomplex.com, where I've posted lots of articles about stuff like this. In fact, you can find links to related articles in the description for this video. I also put a link in there so you can subscribe to the Monster Complex weekly newsletter. Today we're exploring whether the Munsters were heavily inspired by the Fantastic Four. In fact, they have so much in common that this is the first of a planned series of videos. I haven't made the other videos yet, but I predict they're going to look something like this. You're probably thinking that comparing these two families is crazy, but I guarantee that at some point, at least one of these comparisons will make you say, "What the?" Actually, you're going to shout some loud curse word, and I'm going to be a little embarrassed, but don't worry, we'll still be friends. But looking at the Fantastic Four and the Munsters at the same time, there are definite similarities between the two that makes one wonder whether one series made an impact on the other. Let's get into it. When Marvel Comics published the first issue of the Fantastic Four in 1961, that comic book was the launching pad for one of the most iconic media companies ever. In the space of only a couple of years, Marvel introduced some of the most famous characters of all time, eventually leading to one of the most successful movie brands in Hollywood history. When the television show The Munsters hit the air in 1964, it may have only lasted a couple of seasons, but it was one of the first of a big number of crazy, out-of-this-world sitcoms in that era. And even though this show was canceled relatively quickly, The Munsters has survived for decades in syndication and also remakes, revisits, and reboots. Over recent months, I've been reading classic Marvel comics from the beginning, as well as rewatching episodes of the Munsters original series. But that was the first time in my life I was doing both of those so close together, and I began to notice some similarities between the two worlds. And then it struck me how these two series were both created within a very short period of time. Here are a couple of points to keep in mind when considering the idea of a connection between the two. Number one, the crew of the Munsters were working late 1963 or early 1964 on their upcoming TV show. At that time, comic books were mainly distributed through newsstands and in drugstores. As such, the makers of the Munsters would be passing by examples of those groundbreaking Marvel comics every time they were headed out for lunch, or at the drugstore buying toothpaste or cold medicine or whatever. Number two, while many critics tend to claim that comic books are exclusively for children, which technically, for an entire art form, was never a true statement. One of the refreshing outcomes of Marvel Comics' new direction in the early 1960s is that they were attracting a broader audience than traditional comics. Unlike most other comics companies, Marvel was getting notices from college journalists applauding the stimulating worldview being presented by Marvel. Were the Munsters influenced by the breakthroughs that had originated at Marvel Comics? Now, in the original article that I wrote about this, I shared a lot of info about the impact of Marvel Comics and about the origins of the Munsters. If you want to take a deep dive, you can find the link to that article in the description for this video. But right now, here are a few of the points that made me wonder whether there was a connection between the Munsters and the Fantastic Four. The Munsters and the Fantastic Four are monsters. When the Fantastic Four kicked off the Marvel Age, one of the shocking characteristics that set them apart from other superhero series in 1961 was the idea that they were considered monsters. All four of them. Now, looking back on them today, we're sort of used to them, and we only remember one of the members as being a monster. But if you read reprints of those early issues, you begin to notice how all four members of the team were struggling with the impact of their origin story. Of course, as the Marvel Comics world expanded, there have been lots of heroic characters who are monsters. Marvel's dual legacies of monsters and superheroes include the Hulk, Werewolf by Night, Frankenstein's monster, Blade, She-Hulk, Godzilla, Morbius the Living Vampire, Venom, and more. Now, as these comics were first coming out, there were creative people working on the upcoming show The Munsters, which, of course, also featured main characters who were monsters. There were also several occasional guest monsters. In both series, you have monsters who are just trying to live normal lives and who sometimes struggle with how normal people perceive them. The Munsters and the Fantastic Four are families. Another characteristic that connects the Fantastic Four and the Munsters, but sets them apart from other series at the time, is that they are both families. Both series talk about workplace and cultural stuff, but the primary focus of each series is the family unit. In the case of the Fantastic Four, most teams of superheroes are just a club or a business, but the Fantastic Four are first and foremost a family. Yes, the members of the FF bicker. And sure, over the decades, the group has splintered now and then. Sometimes the regular members have gone this way or that and been replaced by temps. But time and again, we've seen that the series brings us back to the main cast, because the Fantastic Four is a family. In the case of the Munsters, one of the series' strengths is that they are taking classic monsters like Frankenstein's monster and Count Dracula and giving them a normal suburban family life. And granted, that formula could have been as simple as mixing the concept of a family sitcom with universal monsters. But in 1964, there was also the chance that somebody on staff was reading the Fantastic Four comic book and they said, hey, look at what they're doing here. The Munsters and the Fantastic Four are set in the real world. Well, real. In the history of comic books, most superheroes have been hanging out in cities that probably had made-up names. Metropolis, Gotham City, Star City, etc. But very early on, the characters in the Marvel Comics universe were living in the real world. In fact, many of them were based in the same place, New York City, which of course is where the Marvel Comics offices are located. In fact, in one issue of the Fantastic Four, there was that time that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the creators behind the series, were working on the comic book when Dr. Doom showed up in their office. Looking back at the classic Universal Monsters movies, many of them were set in imaginary locations. The movies would visit towns created in the Universal backlot, set up to look like old European towns with a castle and an old watchtower and a windmill. The towns looked ancient, yet have telephones and cars. One of the fun characteristics of the Munsters TV series is that the family lives in a normal-looking neighborhood set in the present day. Over the course of the series, we see them heading into town for business and to get supplies and stuff like that. We've seen some of the Munsters go to the bank. We've seen them go to restaurants. We've seen them go to school and other normal-looking places. The Munsters and the Fantastic Four are public figures. For decades, one of the key factors in a superhero comic book had to do with keeping a secret identity and then changing clothes to do your superhero stuff. Wonder Woman was sometimes Diana Prince. Superman was sometimes Clark Kent. Batman was sometimes Bruce Wayne, etc. But from the beginning, the members of the Fantastic Four have been pretty open about their real names. They are, in fact, celebrities. As for monsters, similar to traditional superheroes, it's normal for classic monsters to try and hide. But the monsters are very open with the public. They go to stores, they go to the bank, they go to jobs, they go to all kinds of places. It never even occurs to them that they should live separately from normal people. They deserve to be normal members of society, and that's what they are. You know, it's always interesting to look at our favorite monster stories in books and movies and TV, and then learn about the earlier stories that inspired them. In fact, we talked about some more surprising examples here. Monsters